My name's Kayla. I'm a journalism major here at Grand Valley, and I'm going to introduce Marisa. Marisa is an accomplished investigative reporter and GVSU alum. Currently, she works at USA Today, handling investigations relating to social services and welfare issues like child abuse and neglect, poverty, elder abuse, human trafficking, domestic violence, and access to mental health services. Previously at the Indy Star, Marisa and her colleagues did an investigation into USA Gymnastics that found top officials failed to report many allegations of sexual abuse by coaches. As a result, around 500 women and girls came forward with allegations against Larry Nassar, MSU sports doctor. Nassar pled guilty and is now serving time in prison. The president and board of USA Gymnastics resigned, and a new federal law was made that makes it a crime for national governing bodies to fail to immediately report sex abuse allegations. Beyond that, Marisa has done a series of other investigations, including one into Indiana Adult Protective Services, and that resulted in $1 million budget increase that year in 2016 and additional $3 million in 2017. Also in 2012, Marisa produced a series about parents who falsely claim neglect in order to get mental health services for their children. After publishing, state officials pledged up to $25 million per year to close this gap. Marisa's won over 50 awards, including the IRE Tom Runner Award and the Lewis Lyons Award for Conscience and Integrity in Journalism. She was also one of the 40 under 40 changemakers recognized by the Indianapolis Business Journal in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Marisa Kwiatkowski. Yeah, lengthy introduction. You've done a lot of powerful work. So to start off, could you tell us what you do at USA Today?
Absolutely nothing. No. So I'm part of USA Today's National Investigative Team. So I work on long-term projects about basically anything that I'm interested in, but my expertise tends to be in social services and issues relating to children. So that's where a lot of my work has been over time.
Can you talk about some of the times that you've used FOIA in your investigations and maybe some challenges that you stumbled upon in that process?
I would say solidly 40% of my time is spent navigating public records law. Most of journalism is just it's about getting creative with public records requests. So in terms of examples, one of the craziest, I'll start there, was a request that I put in to get access to child welfare records and police records about a woman who claimed she and her 3 children were possessed by demons. And that claim prompted a multi-agency police investigation, exorcisms, the first ever sanctioned by the Diocese of Gary in Indiana, and also hospital investigation, DCS investigation. So through navigating public records law, initially I was denied those records, and I ended up having the woman file a confidentiality waiver with me, allowing me access to all of her documents, and I ended up getting 900 pages that really made that story and made it possible to kind of share all of the dynamics that were involved. And obviously, you know, almost every story that I do, in fact, I would venture to say every story I do at this point, has multiple public records requests that make it possible.
Can you tell us anything you're working on right now or that you previously published?
No. I can tell you a FOIA-related story about what I'm working on now without telling you what I'm working on, if that counts. So I had put in a request with the federal government. Has anybody in here put in a request with the federal government yet by any chance? Yeah, so you know the pain of putting in a federal public records request. It is brutal. And I wish I should have brought it to put it on the screen for you, but I received an acknowledgement of my public records request earlier this year. And in it, they very kindly told me that my request had been put on the complex track. So there are multiple tracks. I know my friends here who have done it know this. There are multiple tracks that you can have your public records request put on, and the complex one is the really bad one. And so basically what they said is it'll be fulfilled in the order that you get it, which means like years from now, basically. And so what I ended up doing, because like I think I mentioned in the beginning, most of my job is navigating around things to get the information that I need. And I happened to be reading just casually in my free time a federal code of regulations. And in it, it mentioned that private agencies were required under that code to provide information to the public upon request. And so while waiting still, and probably for the next several years, for the response to my public records request, I submitted a request to 135 different agencies, private agencies, for the records that I was looking for. And to date, so that was about 2 weeks ago, and to date I've gotten 50 of them back completely. So that's just one example of, like, first of all, not taking no, and also figuring out ways to get the information you need maybe in a different way.
Can you give us some more examples of how FOIA and public records have really fleshed out the stories that you work on?
Sure. So in the case of USA Gymnastics and the investigation that my colleagues and I did into that and into Larry Nassar, public records were essential to helping us prove that USA Gymnastics had learned of allegations years earlier, had not reported them to authorities, and then other allegations against that same individual followed. And so the way that we did that, in some cases, these coaches would move around. And so wherever they went, allegations of misconduct would follow, but they would just resign or leave that gym and go to another gym. And so by requesting public records from, I think, almost every state, by the end we requested records, we were able to follow where an individual accused of misconduct had gone and navigate through those records to see, first of all, not only how long ago those first allegations came up, but what they did and how many people were affected afterward. And that's another example also of navigating around public records law. I had been in the state of Oregon, I had been denied by one agency a particular record. The exact same agency, a different agency, but the exact same record about the same individual I received from a different agency. And so I was able to go back after appealing and doing the sort of formal process. I went back to that agency that had denied me and I said, look, your neighbor like 30 miles away gave me this exact same record without redaction. So please explain to me why you're saying it's not public record when I'm getting it from the exact same state, about the same person, the same type of record. And they ended up providing it. So that, I mean, a lot of my time gets taken up doing stuff like that.
What advice do you have for the college students and young journalists in the room who want to do investigative reporting?
So I'm super excited to be here, particularly for this session, because this is one of those skills that I wish I would have gotten a lot more training on prior to entering the professional world. So I'm glad that you guys are all here. If I could give you any advice moving forward beyond just sort of the little quirks that I've described to you before, I would say never accept the denial without challenging it. So make sure that when you're getting a denial that you make them provide you with the code or with the part of the law that allows them to deny you that record. And then when they do cite it, make sure you look it up, because a lot of times they're citing something that has absolutely nothing to do with the record that you're asking for. So don't be afraid to go back and push them and get access to those records, because not only are you doing a service for yourself and the work that you're doing, but you're doing a service for whomever comes after you and is looking for records, whether it's a journalist or a member of the public.
No, I don't know how much time we have until we do the hands-on session, but okay, yeah. Well, if anyone has any questions, I'd like to open it up to you guys.
Your alma mater. It's your responsibility. No, I believe, didn't they end up winning the Golden Padlock Award from IRE? So for those of you who haven't heard of that, IRE's Investigative Reporters and Others is a great organization relating to investigative reporting. And they have an award every year that they give out called the Golden Padlock, which is for an agency that is not so helpful, shall we say, in providing records. I'm pretty sure MSU actually got it last year, or earlier this year, excuse me. Oh, yeah, it's great. You should look it up. But I do remember, and I wish I could remember the amount. They were very helpful in the beginning with records that we had asked for, but as scrutiny started to turn to Michigan State University, we started having more time and more pushback on the requests that we made, because we did make several requests, not just one early on. And I think at one point, I wish I could remember the amount. It was in the six figures, but they said it was going to cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to provide us with some records that we were looking for relating to the Nassar investigation. So needless to say, we did not pay that, in case anyone was wondering. We did eventually end up getting a lot of the records. I don't know if we got all of the records from that request, but I guess the simple answer to your question is that it depended on what we were asking for and sort of the level of scrutiny that the organization was facing at the time. That is such a huge thing, because it can be easy, especially if you're starting out your career. You're going to be doing a million things. You're going to be writing a lot of stories probably. You're not going to start out doing long-term stuff like I am. And so a lot of times what I've seen with younger journalists is that you put in a request because you're working on something in the moment, and then you're off to the next crises, and you might have forgotten about that request, or you've moved on, you're on to the next story. And it can become really important, I think, to make sure you follow up on those requests, even if maybe you don't need it anymore. I mean, first of all, you don't know what it is, so you don't know if you need it yet. But it teaches those agencies that if they just delay, that they can make you go away, and that's not true. It's public record, and they should be providing it to the public. That's a great question, and I think where you guys are benefiting from, the more than a decade since I've been here, is that a lot of those things that I wish I'd learned, the school figured out that people need to learn, and you guys are getting those benefits. But I think Grand Valley, when I was here, was fantastic at preparing you for the baseline and the basics that you needed to do this work, because so much has changed from when I started my career. Okay, look, Facebook was like not a thing when I started professionally, so can we just talk about how long ago that was? But here's the thing, so much has changed, but the basics don't change. The commitment to ethics and integrity and accuracy, all of those things don't change, and Grand Valley was great at setting that baseline for me and making sure that I understood the obligation that I had to the public and the things that I needed to do to make sure I did the right thing. There was a question back there, I think. Yeah. So many words. So I'm not going to pretend that my way is the right way, so that's my disclaimer up front. But for me, what I do is I put them in chronological order. And I've done this work long enough that I know what information is in certain types of records, and so that makes me able to go through it faster, being able to look for what I need and the information that I want. I read everything, but I'm organizing it in that way. The other thing I always do is I create a timeline. And so it could be a Word doc, it could be Excel, people do it different ways, but putting a timeline together, because a lot of times when you have that many documents, if you don't put it in order and figure out what you have, you could miss something. And, a great example of that is with Adult Protective Services. When I was requesting all of the records for that investigation, it wasn't until I put the timeline together that I realized there had been 20 days between when they had received a call about a woman who was in danger and had actually gone out there to see if she was okay, which was in violation of the policies and statutes that were in place. And so I wouldn't have realized that with all the records I had if I hadn't put together a timeline to make that obvious, if that makes sense. Yeah. Wow. So there are media law classes, of course, but I think I used to cover criminal courts earlier in my career, and so that was really helpful in starting to understand the law. The other thing that I would encourage all of you to do, whether you end up in Michigan or you end up in a different state, is the first thing that you should be doing when you're starting your career is reading the public records law in the state where you are, because you need to know what information you have access to and, you know, what those parameters are. And so that can be really helpful. And almost every state has some sort of expert in access law or in the law. And so making sure that you make a connection with that person too. So there are two people in Indiana, just as an easy example. There's a public access counselor whose job it is to navigate public records law and to, you know, if there's a denial that a member of the public or a journalist feels is unjust, that they navigate through that. And so they're a great resource for the law in navigating around that kind of thing. And they also have a press association, and the executive director has decades of experience in public records law. So finding that person wherever you end up, either in your career or wherever you need to make a request, can be incredibly helpful, because it's just impossible for us to be experts in everything. And so knowing where to find the resources to get the information you need is really important. Well, both things are incredibly important for journalism. Data is incredibly important, but people are incredibly important because people care about people, right? You have to make them understand why something matters. And so, you know, most of the best investigations have a combination of both. How do you get to the real people is usually through the data, right? It could be that you've requested a certain type of record, or the other thing is you start to do a search and a particular case catches your attention, and then you realize by requesting data that that's part of a broader systemic problem. And so, you know, sometimes the people come first, sometimes the data comes first. It just sort of depends on what the situation is. But one of the first things that I'm doing when I'm thinking about whether I want to pursue an investigation is what data could be out there that I could request that could help me understand what's going on here. And, you know, it could be federal, it could be state, it could be local. There are a lot of different places that keep information. And so figuring out where that might be, and, you know, getting creative sometimes, because a lot of times we think that maybe it's just the state that has all the information that we need, but there's a lot of different agencies that may maintain databases that are helpful that maybe is not top of mind that you don't think of. So like, you know, with the example of the private agencies that I was telling you guys about earlier, they told me in some of the responses that I got when I sent out that request to private agencies, they're like, nobody's ever asked us for this before. And I'm like, probably nobody's reading the Code of Federal Regulations, so that's probably why. Anybody want to do one last question before we move to the fun part? So being as specific as possible, taking that extra maybe half an hour or an hour to figure out what the name of the record is called. So have you guys heard or talked about retention schedules at all? Or requesting blank forms of things? So retention schedule is like, almost every agency has it. I would venture to guess probably most of them do nowadays, but it's how long they have to keep certain types of records and what sort of records they keep. And so that's a good way to help you figure out, okay, if I need this type of record, what information can I expect to be within that record? And so you can look at a blank form of it and know what information would be there. So taking that extra few minutes, I'm not saying take like days and weeks or whatever, but taking that extra time to figure out what the information specifically is that you're looking for will make your request go faster, because they're going to know that you know what you're talking about, right? The other thing is I try and be as specific as possible with the code citation. So if there's a very specific code citation for that particular type of record, then I make sure I request it. So just as an example, because I know Indiana law really well, there's a specific code citation for personnel records, and there's a specific code citation for police radio logs. And so when I'm requesting those types of records, I'm using that very specific code citation to show them that I know the record exists, I know that it's public, and that I know that they need to provide it. And so that can be incredibly helpful. The other thing I do is every request I put in, I track in a spreadsheet, and I remind myself, when I need to follow up, and that way I make sure that I'm tracking, did they acknowledge it in the time frame that they were supposed to have acknowledged it? Do I need to follow up, and on what date did I get the records, and did they provide everything that they were supposed to? So just like being organized and tracking that information can really help you in the long run. All right, let's go.